I sold my mother's lake house and her Toyota Hilux without telling her. Used the money for a 3-week luxury trip to Greece and the Maldives with Philippe. And honestly, I thought I was being smart, but this is eating me up inside. I thought I was finally taking control of my life after watching her struggle financially since Dad died. But what happened when we returned from our $25,000 escapade completely destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family, my inheritance, and who the real victim in this story actually was. My name is Celeste Dubois-Martineau. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Quebec with my husband, Philippe. We grew up in the same neighborhood. He was like a second son to Mom. She loved him like family for decades. 7 months ago, my father Henri died of a heart attack climbing the stairs at home, right after preparing tea for him and Mom, like they did every night for 45 years. Since then, I'd been visiting Mom 3 times a week, helping with groceries at Metro, accompanying her to medical appointments at the CLSC. I really thought I was being a good daughter, but I was also calculating every move. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you were protecting someone by taking control of their choices? Because that's exactly what I told myself when I forged the power of attorney documents and sold everything. I was shopping at IGA when I finally had the courage to call my mom and tell her I had sold her belongings. Subscribe to the channel, and before you judge, just listen to how this decision completely backfired. Because what I discovered about our family fortune when we returned from the Maldives will make you question everything about assumptions and financial secrets. The thing is, after Dad died, Mom became this shadow of herself. Marguerite Dubois had always been the strongest woman I knew, but grief broke something fundamental inside her. She'd forget to eat, wear the same clothes for days, sit staring at nothing for hours. When I'd find her like that, my heart would break. But honestly, another part of me started seeing opportunity. Philippe noticed it first. He'd been practically family since we were kids, calling her Maman Marguerite, eating her Christmas tourtière, being defended by her when his own parents were too harsh. So when he started suggesting we needed to help Mom with her finances, it felt natural, not manipulative. The numbers were terrifying. Dad's pension was gone. Mom's savings were dwindling fast, and she had property taxes on the Lac Saint-Jean cottage, plus insurance on that massive Hilux she barely drove anymore. After a minor fender bender that shattered her driving confidence, the truck just sat under the maple tree, accumulating dust and monthly payments she couldn't afford. Philippe was laid off 6 months earlier when construction work dried up. I was working part-time at a dental office, barely covering our own bills. We'd been talking about taking a real vacation for years, dreaming about Greece and tropical beaches, but it seemed impossible on our income. Until we started looking at Mom's assets differently. The cottage had been empty since Dad died. 20 years of family summers, morning fishing trips, screened porch conversations, all reduced to an expensive liability generating bills Mom couldn't handle. The Hilux was even worse. A 2015 black pickup that Dad had babied obsessively, now just a painful reminder taking up space and money. So we developed what felt like a family rescue plan. Philippe found buyers through his construction contacts, people who'd actually love and use these things instead of letting them rot. I handled the paperwork, which is where things got complicated. Mom had signed power of attorney documents right after Dad died, when everything felt overwhelming and she needed help with insurance claims and bank procedures. But those papers had expired months ago. The legal authority was only for immediate post-death logistics, not ongoing financial decisions. I knew this. Philippe knew this. But we also knew buyers wouldn't necessarily check dates carefully if everything looked official. I extended some dates, modified language, made it appear Mom had given me broader authority than she actually had. It felt like a tiny lie serving a greater good, like telling a white lie to spare someone's feelings. The cottage sold for $180,000 to a lovely retired couple who talked about their grandchildren visiting, about morning coffee on the screened porch. I felt good selling to people who'd love it. The truck deal was even easier. The used car dealer barely glanced at paperwork, more interested in the vehicle's pristine condition. Philippe had detailed it perfectly, making it shine like new. Cash transaction, no questions, done in under an hour. With over $200,000 in hand, we planned our dream vacation. First-class flights to Athens, a week island hopping through Santorini and Mykonos, then connecting to Malé for 2 weeks in an overwater bungalow resort that cost more per night than I usually made in a week. Private beach dinners, couples massages, swimming with dolphins, everything I'd ever dreamed a vacation could be. But first, I had to tell Mom I'd planned to visit her in person, sit at her kitchen table, explain everything gently with bank statements showing why these decisions made sense. Instead, I found myself standing in the cereal aisle at IGA, staring at cornflakes, phone trembling in my hand. Philippe was home packing our suitcases, boarding passes printed and waiting, and I realized I couldn't face seeing her reaction in person, so I called her like a coward. I told her we were leaving for Greece the next morning, that we'd sold the cottage and truck, that we needed the money for this trip. The silence stretched forever. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and confused, asking about Papa's truck, about the cottage. I explained about property taxes and insurance costs, about how she wasn't using either asset anyway. Her voice changed then, became steadier but distant. She asked where the money went. I told her about our vacation, about Greece and the Maldives, about how we'd been planning this for so long. Another pause. Then she said she understood, wished us a safe trip, and hung up. Standing there surrounded by families doing normal grocery shopping, holding my dead phone, I felt this weird mixture of relief and guilt. But I pushed the guilt down. I told myself she'd understand eventually, that when we returned happy and refreshed with beautiful photos and stories, she'd forgive us. She'd see we'd use the money for memories, for experiences that would strengthen our marriage. The next morning, Philippe and I took a taxi to Pierre Elliott Trudeau Airport. As our plane lifted through Montreal's gray sky toward Greek sunshine, I felt intoxicating excitement and relief. I had no idea that back in Quebec, Mom was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the empty hook where Dad's truck keys used to hang, beginning to understand that everything she thought she knew about her family and finances was about to change completely. Greece was paradise. Santorini's white buildings against impossible blue skies, ancient ruins that made me feel connected to history, food that tasted like sunshine and ocean breeze. Philippe and I felt like celebrities, staying in hotels with infinity pools, taking sunset cruises, buying souvenirs without checking prices. For the first time in years, money felt unlimited. The Maldives was even better. Our overwater bungalow had glass floors showing tropical fish swimming beneath our feet. We snorkeled in coral gardens, had private dinners on white sand beaches, watched stars from our deck while dolphins played in bioluminescent water. It was pure magic, the kind of luxury I'd only seen in magazines. Every day I took hundreds of photos and videos, documenting every perfect moment. I imagined showing Mom these memories, explaining how her sacrifice had created something beautiful and meaningful. I convinced myself she'd be proud of how we'd transformed her unused assets into experiences that would last forever. Philippe was happier than I'd ever seen him. The stress lines from months of unemployment disappeared. He laughed constantly, joked with resort staff, planned excursions with boyish enthusiasm. This vacation wasn't just rest and relaxation, it was healing our marriage, reconnecting us after a difficult year of financial strain and family grief. By week 2, I'd almost forgotten about the guilt. Sun and luxury have a way of making ethical concerns feel distant and abstract. I started posting photos on social media, sharing stories about overwater bungalows and swimming with manta rays. Friends and family commented with envy and excitement, praising us for taking such an amazing adventure. Nobody asked how we'd afforded it. Nobody questioned whether a construction worker and dental assistant should be staying in resorts that cost $500 per night. They just saw beautiful photos and happy faces, assuming we'd saved carefully or gotten some kind of amazing deal. The last week flew by in a blur of final excursions and resort amenities. We swam in lagoons, had couples massages, ate gourmet meals while watching sunset from our private deck. I felt transformed, like I'd discovered who I really was underneath years of financial stress and small-town limitations. On our last night, Philippe and I sat on our deck drinking champagne, talking about how this trip had changed everything. We felt sophisticated, worldly, like people who belonged in places this beautiful. I thanked him for pushing me to be brave, for recognizing that sometimes you have to take control of situations to create the life you deserve. The flight home felt like returning from a different planet. 24 hours earlier, we'd been swimming in crystal-clear water, being served tropical drinks by attentive staff, living like royalty in paradise. Now we were cramped in economy seats, surrounded by crying babies and airplane food, facing the reality of returning to Quebec in March with its gray skies and dirty snow. But I wasn't worried. I felt empowered, confident, ready to rebuild my relationship with Mom and start our new life with the perspective and energy this vacation had given us. I had beautiful photos to share, incredible stories to tell, proof that taking bold action had created something meaningful and transformative. I had no idea that while we'd been living in luxury for 3 weeks, Mom had been busy too. She'd been making discoveries, having conversations, learning things about our family that would make our beautiful vacation photos look like evidence in a criminal case. The taxi ride from the airport to our apartment felt surreal. Quebec's gray March landscape looked almost black and white after 3 weeks of tropical colors. Our neighborhood seemed smaller, shabbier, more cramped than I remembered. But I was still riding the high of our adventure, still convinced we'd made the right choice. Philippe carried our suitcases upstairs while I sorted through 3 weeks of accumulated mail. Bills, advertisements, a few personal letters, nothing unusual. I was planning to unpack, do laundry, maybe call Mom to share some vacation stories and start rebuilding our relationship with gentle conversation and beautiful photos. Philippe's phone rang, and I could see his face change from relaxed vacation glow to pure panic in seconds. He answered with a shaky voice, walking to the balcony like he didn't want me to hear. But I followed him, my stomach already twisting with dread. It was his cousin Mark, calling about some legal papers that had arrived at Philippe's parents' house while we were away. Papers with official government letterheads, addressed to Philippe regarding properties he supposedly owned but had sold without proper authorization. My blood ran cold. This wasn't supposed to happen. The power of attorney documents I'd modified should have covered everything. The buyers should have done their due diligence. The whole transaction should have been clean and simple. But Mark kept talking about lawyers and investigators, about someone named Maître Bélanger who was asking questions about forged documents and illegal property transfers. About how Philippe's name was connected to fraudulent sales because I'd used his construction contacts to find buyers. I grabbed the phone from Philippe's trembling hands. Mark explained that Mom had hired this lawyer immediately after we left for Greece. She'd discovered the sales within days and started legal proceedings to reverse everything. Not only had she gotten the cottage back, but she was pressing charges for fraud and forgery. The buyers had been cooperative, apparently understanding they'd purchased stolen property. They'd returned the cottage keys and received full refunds from some mysterious source. The truck dealership had been more complicated, but somehow that had been resolved too. What terrified me most was Mark's final piece of information. Mom wasn't just undoing the sales. She was going after everything we owned. Our apartment, our savings, even our vacation photos were being treated as evidence of criminal activity. I hung up and stared at Philippe, both of us still in our travel clothes, suitcases full of expensive souvenirs and memories that now felt like weapons pointed directly at our future. We'd spent 3 weeks thinking we were living like royalty, when actually we were just suspects in a case we didn't even know existed. The doorbell rang 30 minutes later. 2 police officers stood in our hallway, holding official documents and asking very polite but terrifying questions about our recent activities and how we'd funded our Mediterranean adventure. That's when I realized Mom had been planning her own revenge while we'd been planning our dream vacation. And she was apparently much better at strategy than I'd ever imagined. The police interview lasted 3 hours. They asked detailed questions about our income, our vacation expenses, the timeline of property sales, and how exactly we'd obtained legal authority to sell assets that weren't technically ours. I stuck to our story about helping Mom with her financial difficulties, but every answer felt increasingly desperate. What disturbed me most wasn't their questions about the forged documents or illegal sales. It was their confidence. These officers weren't fishing for information or trying to build a case. They already had everything they needed. They were just confirming details for paperwork that was apparently already in progress. After they left, Philippe and I sat in our living room surrounded by vacation souvenirs that now felt like evidence. Greek olive oil, Maldivian shell jewelry, hundreds of photos showing us living beyond our means while Mom supposedly struggled in poverty. Everything beautiful had become potentially incriminating. But I still didn't understand the scope of what we were facing until Maître Bélanger called me directly the next morning. His voice was professional, but carried an undercurrent of barely contained disgust that made my skin crawl. He explained that Mom had retained his services the day after we left for Greece. She'd brought him documents, bank statements, and evidence that painted a very different picture of our family finances than what I'd believed. Documents that suggested I'd stolen from someone who was far from the helpless widow I'd convinced myself she was. The conversation that changed everything happened when he mentioned Mom's basement. Specifically, something about a combination safe that had been installed behind the old furnace 30 years ago. Something Dad had mentioned to Mom in private notes she'd found after we left for vacation. My hand started shaking before he even finished the sentence. A safe in Mom's basement meant secrets. Dad had been fanatically honest about everything, almost obsessively transparent about family finances. If he'd hidden something from both Mom and me for decades, it wasn't sentimental jewelry or important documents. It was something that would explain why Mom could afford to hire Quebec's most expensive inheritance lawyer on 24 hours' notice. Something that would explain how she'd managed to reverse fraudulent property sales and refund buyers without breaking a sweat financially. Maître Bélanger's next words made my vacation photos look like documentation of the stupidest crime in Canadian history. The number Madra. Bélanger read to me over the phone was so large I asked him to repeat it twice. $3.7 million. That's what Dad had accumulated over 30 years of secret investments, hidden in accounts and properties that Mom never knew existed until she'd found his private notes taped inside their wedding album. I sat down hard on my kitchen floor, surrounded by Greek olive oil and Maldivian souvenirs, trying to process that we'd stolen vacation money from a multimillionaire, not a struggling widow counting pennies, but someone who could have funded 100 trips like ours without blinking. Dad had been a carpenter. Not just any carpenter, but one who'd specialized in restoring heritage buildings throughout Quebec. What I'd never known was that instead of just taking payment for his work, he'd negotiated ownership stakes in several properties he'd renovated. Small percentages that had grown into substantial assets over decades. The cottage I'd sold for $180,000? It was the least valuable thing our family owned. Mom was also part owner of the boutique hotel Dad had helped restore in Old Quebec, 3 heritage apartments in Montreal, and a commercial building in Chicoutimi that housed 4 businesses. But the real revelation was what Maître Bélanger told me about the power of attorney documents I'd forged. I hadn't just committed fraud against a struggling elderly woman. I'd committed fraud against one of Quebec's wealthiest widows, someone who could afford to pursue criminal charges regardless of cost or time. The lawyer's voice was calm as he explained that Mom had already recovered every dollar we'd spent on vacation. The hotel bills, flights, resort fees, every overpriced cocktail and excursion had been traced and documented. She was demanding full restitution, plus legal fees, plus punitive damages for emotional distress. The total amount we owed was $847,000. more than 4 times what we'd actually stolen, but completely legal under Quebec inheritance law when fraud was involved with elderly victims. Philippe was standing in the doorway when I hung up, his face pale and confused. He'd been listening to my side of the conversation, trying to piece together numbers and legal terms that didn't make sense with the woman we thought we knew. I looked at him, this man I'd loved and trusted and conspired with, and realized I was about to lose everything. Our apartment would be seized, our savings frozen, our credit destroyed for decades. All for a vacation that had lasted 3 weeks, but would cost us the rest of our lives. But what broke my heart completely was realizing that Mom had known. During all those visits when she'd seemed helpless and confused, when I'd been calculating how to exploit her vulnerability, she'd been watching me plan my own destruction. For 3 days, Philippe and I lived in this surreal bubble of terror and disbelief. We couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't pay the restitution, couldn't even understand how our lives had collapsed so completely. We talked about filing for bankruptcy, leaving Quebec, maybe even leaving Canada entirely. Desperate plans from desperate people who'd gambled everything on a vacation. But what started eating at me wasn't the legal consequences or financial ruin. It was Philippe's behavior. Since the lawyer's call, he'd become quiet and withdrawn in ways that didn't match someone who was supposedly as shocked as I was by Mom's wealth. He'd disappear for hours, claiming he was looking for work or talking to family, but always returning more agitated than before. On Thursday morning, while Philippe was out on one of his mysterious errands, I decided to go see Mom in person. Not to apologize or beg for forgiveness, but to try understanding how she'd hidden such massive wealth from her own family for decades. I needed to see the woman who'd apparently been playing chess while I thought we were playing checkers. The bus ride to her house felt like traveling to another planet. Every familiar street and landmark looked different when I realized the woman I'd been manipulating could have bought most of them without affecting her budget. I'd been so arrogantly confident in my exploitation of her vulnerability, when actually she'd been watching me incriminate myself with every decision. Mom answered the door looking healthier and more alert than I'd seen her since Dad died. Gone was the confused, fragile widow who'd supposedly needed my help with everything. This woman was sharp-eyed, well-dressed, and absolutely terrifying. In her composed control of the situation she'd orchestrated, she invited me in for tea like nothing had changed, like we were still the loving mother and daughter having our regular weekly visit. But everything about her body language screamed calculation and strategy. She'd prepared for this conversation, probably planned every word she was going to say. What she told me over Earl Grey and digestive cookies shattered what little remained of my understanding of our family dynamics. Not just about Dad's secret investments or her hidden wealth, but about Philippe specifically. About conversations they'd had, information he'd shared, and agreements they'd apparently made while I thought everyone was keeping me informed about everything. I need to know. Would you have gone to see your mother in person after discovering she'd been hiding millions? Comment your honest answer below, because what Mom told me about Philippe next destroyed more than just my marriage. The betrayal I'd committed against Mom suddenly felt insignificant compared to the betrayal that had been committed against me. And it had been happening for much longer than 3 weeks. Mom sipped her tea calmly before dropping the bomb that destroyed my marriage, along with everything else. She told me that Philippe had known about Dad's wealth for over 2 years. Not suspected, not guessed, but known with complete certainty about the millions hidden in secret accounts and property investments. Dad had told him during his final months, when he was getting sicker and needed help organizing his affairs. Philippe had been sworn to secrecy, asked to help protect the family from financial predators and inheritance disputes by keeping the wealth hidden until Mom was emotionally ready to handle it alone. But Philippe had seen an opportunity instead of a responsibility. He'd been slowly, carefully manipulating me into becoming the perfect scapegoat for a theft he'd been planning since before Dad even died. Every suggestion about Mom's finances, every pressure to take control of her assets, every justification, For selling property had been calculated manipulation designed to make me the criminal, while he remained the innocent bystander. The power of attorney documents I thought I'd modified cleverly? Philippe had helped me forge them, making sure I left just enough evidence to be caught eventually. The buyers he'd found through his construction contacts weren't random opportunities. They were people he'd specifically chosen because they were connected to legal networks that would report suspicious transactions. Even our vacation timing had been strategic. Philippe had insisted we leave immediately after the sales, knowing that Mom would discover everything within days and start legal proceedings while we were unreachable in Greece and the Maldives. By the time we returned, the case against me would be ironclad, and he could claim he'd been an unwilling accomplice to his manipulative wife's criminal scheme. Mom showed me copies of text messages Philippe had sent her while we were on vacation. Messages expressing his shock and regret about my actions, his willingness to cooperate with authorities, his concern about how I'd deceived him into participating in fraud. He'd been building his defense and destroying my credibility while I'd been posting happy photos of our stolen paradise. But the most sickening revelation was why Philippe had done it. He hadn't been planning to steal Mom's money and disappear. He'd been planning to frame me for attempted theft, position himself as the family hero who'd helped recover stolen assets, and then gradually work his way into Mom's trust, and eventually her will as the son-in-law who'd saved her from her criminal daughter. I sat there staring at this woman who'd watched me destroy myself while my husband orchestrated my destruction, and realized I'd been the only person in this story who hadn't been playing a game. Everyone else had been strategizing while I'd been stumbling blindly toward my own trap. Walking home from Mom's house, I felt this strange shift happening inside me. The guilt and shame I'd been carrying started transforming into something sharper and more dangerous. Maybe I had been wrong about the theft, but I'd been naive, not evil. Philippe and Mom had played me like a chess piece, and suddenly I wasn't sure who the real villain was anymore. I started analyzing every conversation Philippe and I had shared over the past year. His unemployment hadn't been bad luck, it had been strategic timing. His pressure about Mom's finances hadn't been concern, it had been manipulation. Even our marriage problems, which I'd blamed on financial stress, had probably been manufactured to make me more desperate and controllable. But you know what? I'm not completely innocent in this story either. Even before I knew about Philippe's betrayal, I had made a choice to forge documents and steal from someone I thought was vulnerable. The fact that she wasn't actually vulnerable doesn't erase my intent to exploit weakness. I had been willing to betray family for personal gain, and that reveals something dark about my character. When I got home, Philippe was sitting at our kitchen table with papers spread everywhere, looking like he'd been crying. For a split second, I felt sympathy for him, thinking we were both victims of circumstances beyond our control. Then I remembered Mom's text messages and realized this was probably another performance designed to manipulate my emotions. He looked up at me with those puppy dog eyes that had convinced me to trust him with everything, and asked if I'd talk to Mom about maybe working out a payment plan for restitution. The audacity was breathtaking. He was still pretending to be the concerned husband trying to fix his wife's criminal mistakes, even though he'd orchestrated the entire disaster. I sat down across from him and asked a simple question that had been burning in my mind since Mom's revelations. I asked him when exactly he'd decided that destroying me was worth more than loving me. The question came out calm and curious, like I was asking about his lunch plans. Philippe's face went through this fascinating series of micro-expressions as he realized I knew something. Confusion, calculation, panic, resignation. In about 30 seconds, I watched my husband transform from fake victim back into the predator he'd apparently always been. What happened next changed everything about how I understood not just our marriage, but my own capacity for strategic thinking when survival was at stake. Philippe tried to maintain his innocent act for about 5 minutes before giving up completely. Once he realized I knew the truth, his whole personality shifted into something I'd never seen before. Cold, analytical, almost admiring of the trap he'd constructed around me. He actually seemed proud of how cleverly he'd manipulated the situation. He explained his plan like he was describing a business strategy. Frame me for theft, position himself as the victim of my deception, gradually gain Mom's trust as the son-in-law who'd helped save her fortune, eventually become her primary heir when she updated her will to exclude her criminal daughter. It was sophisticated, long-term thinking that had been operating while I'd been focused on immediate problems. But what disturbed me most wasn't his betrayal. It was how calm I felt listening to him describe my destruction. I should have been screaming, crying, throwing things. Instead, I found myself analyzing his strategy with the same detachment he was showing. Maybe we were more alike than I'd realized, both capable of using people we claimed to love when circumstances demanded it. Philippe made one critical error in his confession, though. He assumed I was powerless now that his manipulation had been exposed. He figured I'd either accept my role as the scapegoat or fight uselessly against a system where he held all the advantages. He didn't consider that I might have inherited some strategic thinking abilities from parents who'd hidden millions for decades. I listened to everything he had to say, asked clarifying questions like I was genuinely impressed by his planning, even thanked him for explaining how thoroughly he'd outmaneuvered me. Philippe relaxed as he talked, probably enjoying the opportunity to brag about his manipulation skills to the primary target. Then I excused myself to use the bathroom and made a phone call that Philippe never saw coming. See, while Mom had been revealing Philippe's betrayal, she'd also mentioned something interesting about Quebec inheritance law, specifically about how fraud charges could be dropped if the victim chose not to pursue prosecution, and about how wealthy people sometimes preferred private restitution over public criminal proceedings that attracted media attention. Most importantly, she'd suggested that sometimes the best punishment for betrayal wasn't prison, but ensuring the betrayer gets exactly what they thought they wanted, only to discover it wasn't what they'd expected. I called Mom and told her I had a counter-proposal she might find interesting. What I proposed to Mom was beautifully simple. Instead of sending me to prison for fraud, we would stage a different kind of justice that would satisfy her need for revenge while teaching Philippe a lesson about manipulating the women in our family. Mom would publicly forgive me, claiming maternal love overcame her anger about the theft. She'd drop all criminal charges and accept my public apology, appearing magnanimous and family-oriented to the community. Philippe would be portrayed as the supportive husband who'd helped his wife see the error of her ways and make amends. But privately, Philippe and I would sign divorce papers that gave me nothing from our marriage except freedom from his manipulation. I would leave Quebec, start over somewhere else, maybe even rebuild my relationship with Mom slowly over time. He would stay in Quebec, apparently victorious in his scheme to remove me from the family inheritance picture. The catch, which Philippe wouldn't discover until much later, was Mom's plan for her actual will. She'd already decided that her massive fortune wouldn't go to any family member. Every dollar would go to charitable organizations focused on elder abuse prevention, specifically protecting seniors from financial exploitation by relatives. Philippe would spend years positioning himself as the perfect son-in-law, being attentive and helpful and trustworthy, slowly gaining Mom's confidence and affection. He'd probably convince himself that his patience and strategy were paying off, that eventually he'd inherit millions as reward for his loyalty. But when Mom died, Philippe would discover that his manipulation had gained him nothing. Worse than nothing, actually, since he'd destroyed his marriage and reputation for the chance to inherit money that was never going to exist for him. The ultimate irony was that Philippe's betrayal had revealed something important about my own character. I'd always thought I was too soft and trusting for strategic thinking, but apparently I'd inherited more of my parents' capacity for long-term planning than anyone realized. Mom loved this proposal. She said it reminded her of something Dad would have suggested, letting people's own greed and manipulation destroy them while appearing to reward their bad behavior. We shook hands on it like business partners, and for the first time since our disaster began, I felt like I was playing chess instead of being a pawn. Philippe never suspected that his victory was actually his punishment. 2 years later, I'm living in Vancouver under my maiden name, working as a financial advisor helping people plan for retirement. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now professionally devoted to preventing exactly the kind of financial exploitation I once attempted against my own mother. Philippe is still in Quebec, still playing the role of devoted son-in-law, still believing he's slowly working his way into Mom's inheritance. He sends her flowers on holidays, visits twice a week, helps with household maintenance, and probably thinks his patience and dedication are building toward a massive payoff. What he doesn't know is that Mom and I talk every Sunday morning. Not the stilted, guilty conversations you might expect between a mother and the daughter who tried to steal from her, but genuine discussions about books, current events, and the strange satisfaction of watching someone manipulate themselves into exactly the trap they deserve. Mom's health is excellent for a 69-year-old woman with millions of dollars and access to the best medical care in Canada. She could live another 20 years, which means Philippe has decades of devoted son-in-law performance ahead of him before he discovers his inheritance doesn't exist. Sometimes I feel guilty about the elaborate revenge we've constructed, but then I remember Philippe's face when he was explaining how cleverly he'd manipulated me into becoming a criminal. The pride he took in destroying someone who loved and trusted him completely. The way he'd been planning to profit from my disgrace for years before executing his scheme. Subscribe now to hear more stories like this. And tell me honestly, did Philippe deserve this revenge? Or did I become the real villain? I genuinely need your opinion on this. The truth is, Philippe and I both made choices that revealed our real characters under pressure. I chose to steal from someone I thought was vulnerable, which makes me selfish and opportunistic. But he chose to destroy someone he claimed to love, which makes him something worse than selfish. Maybe we're both getting exactly what we deserve. I'm getting a second chance to build an honest life, and he's getting exactly what he thought he wanted, forever, without ever getting to enjoy it. Mom was right about something she told me during our negotiation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't punishment. It's giving people exactly what they think they want, and letting them discover why they shouldn't have wanted it. I sold my mother's house and truck to fund a luxury vacation. But the real cost was learning who I really was under pressure, and who the people I trusted really were when their masks came off. The vacation ended, but the education lasted forever.